So now to our contemporary poets, and the first one to read for us this evening, which is in tandem with her position in the book, is Maggie Wadey. Now Maggie's got two poems in the book. One is called Like Swallows, the other is called How Do You Spell Apocalypse? Maggie's had quite a bit of success recently with her poetry. She had a poem called The Hare, highly commended in the Sentinel Poetry Competition, and another one called The Lost Poem is going to be published in the London literary magazine Pomegranate. So she's still been very active, even after her success with these two poems in our own anthology. So Maggie, can I invite you to unmute, please, and read Like Swallows?
Thank you. Like swallows. They came like swallows, the young ones, 18 that year, beautiful, quarrelsome, absurd, powered by desires as yet unspoken, and everything still to play for, even in their own doom-heavy, tech-laden, anxious times. They came like swallows, the young ones, choosing to win, to lose, to speak out, or some to keep to the narrow path of personal ambition, of love or study, holding faith that their future must surely deliver something at least of pleasure, treasure, a measure of the plenty lavished on their parents' generation. They came like swallows, the young ones, out of the traces and into the race, torn as they were between fight or flight, high-hearted even in this damaged place that we, like careless thugs, have gifted them. They came like swallows, the young ones, flying into the mockery of this year's spring.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, Maggie. It is such a compelling image, isn't it? Like swallows. It says so much about young people coming into a world in which I suppose they don't know exactly which way the wind is going to blow them. I just wondered how you came up with that image and the title from that.
I think the phrase just came to me. I have two grandchildren. One was 18 at the time. This was written very much also in response to the climate crisis. And that was part of it, though I wrote it last year. And I was just aware that they were flying in, they were young, they were arriving in this new world, and so much that we'd taken for granted, my generation anyway, was going to be problematic for them, or wasn't there at all. So,
and am I right in thinking that this poem was actually read at a demonstration in London?
it was.
What's about?
It was read last October at an Extinction Rebellion demonstration in Parliament Square. And the swallow, actually, though I didn't connect it with that, the swallow is one of the logos that they have on the Extinction Rebellion flags and posters and so on. And it's part of the youth group, particularly of Extinction Rebellion. And so they suggested that they would like to read it. So I was amazed, and they asked me to read, and I said, no, I couldn't possibly stand up in Parliament Square and read a poem. So somebody else read it for me, but it was a wonderful experience, I must say.
That must have been absolutely the power of the poet.
Oh, it was extraordinary.
Yeah, well done. So, okay, so let's move on to your second poem. How do you spell apocalypse? And would you like to explain to me why you were stressing this week about an Australian accent?
Well, this poem actually is written in the voice of a young Australian bloke, and I obviously I can't really do that with my voice, so you'll have to forgive it. And imagine it's a young chap who's about to be 18, who's arrived in London. And similarly, this was an Extinction Rebellion demonstration that he kind of wandered into, and he didn't quite know what was going on.
Okay.
So that's where it came from.
Right.
So I'll do my best. It was real hot for the time of year, and I remember thinking, if it's this hot here, what'll it be like back home in Oz, where it hasn't rained, not so you'd notice, best part of a year. But we had the luck to be in London, city of our dreams. And next April 2020 was branded on my heart. I'd be 18, my adult life would start. Blissed out on sunshine there in Parliament Square, we soon became aware some kind of demo was going on. Encircled by police, a polite English crowd with pale bare arms, sweet-faced girls and guys in tight black jeans, were sitting in the middle of the road, waiting an eternity, it seemed, to be allowed to hand in letters to what I'd always supposed was their very own House of Commons. Then an old woman with bright blue eyes lowered herself, groaning, to the floor beside us, and squinting at her notebook, looked up to ask, "How do you spell apocalypse?"
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Maggie. And yeah, the Australian accent held up there. I could definitely hear it. So all that was missing from the demonstration in Parliament Square was a reading of one of your poems.
Yes, it was. I'm there again tomorrow, but there's not going to be a poem. But anyway, I'm there again tomorrow. So let's hope I don't get arrested.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Maggie
Thank you.
Wadey, which is your name in the book, for reading to us your two poems. So we'll move on now to Kerry Derbyshire. Kerry, one of our own Cumbrian poets. Hi, Kerry.
Hi.
And your poem was one of those commended by Kathleen in the competition. It is called In the Air.
Yeah.
And Kerry, would you like to read it for us right now?
I would. In the air. What if this should change? The crabapple in blossom, leaning on a hawthorn like an old friend. The brown and white cows cutting the lush meadow beyond the wall. The rumble of John's tractor checking ewes and lambs. Tyres weaving morning's dew. The hedge of May like brides in wedding gowns beneath a lucky blue sky. What if this should change? These thistles pushing through turf, keen as fans at a football match. My dog, nose to ground, tracing every drop of last night's musk. The resident owl, who never seems to sleep, calling from the gill where the plough always stops between two sycamores and the smell of weather stays sharp. What if this should change? The first swallows leaping air at finding last year's nests in the barn. Orange tips giddying bluebells by the river, playing last night's rain. The cheeky pair of squirrels darting up the trunk of the pine. The cocky pheasant parading his apple orchard. What if this should change? Bracken brushing green over the fell, where my children found bleached skulls, and the distant estuary gleams like a star. Here, where winter follows footprints through gorse, where deer and fox graze unafraid. What if I never hear their bark again?
Lovely.
Yeah, I love the way you
Lovely.
caught the uncertainty of everything, Kerry. That suddenly we lived in a world where we took everything for granted and everything seemed safe. And suddenly we were pitched into this situation where nothing was certain, and we were questioning everything and feeling actually quite vulnerable. And I think that this poem, it's got some beautiful images of the natural world in it, and it just catches which should be permanent, but it caught that uncertainty coming on top of the climate change anxiety as well, that suddenly we were consumed with anxiety.
Yes, yes. Yes, I felt that, because I have a walk around the field every day with the dogs, and I was just walking around and it just suddenly hit me, that everything seemed to be changing. And, even though these trees, these grasses, these animals have been here forever, I just felt, as you say, the word uncertain about everything. So yes, it really did spring from that. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, I really found that quite an emotional poem to listen to. It's almost as if you go from the Garden of Eden to the apocalypse in one change of mood, which is summed up by the very last line. You paint this beautiful, almost idyllic picture of what life is like, and then what if I never hear their bark again? And you just think, do you know what? That's a very close to the bone line. That really is, and that really hit me right there. So thank you very much, Kerry. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great poem. Okay, right. So next up would be Isabel Thrilling, who was also commended for her poem called "The Goats of Llandudno." Isabel can't be here, but she did ask if somebody else could read her poem on this occasion. So Kathleen has kindly agreed to do that. So Kathleen, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure you all saw the images of Llandudno without traffic. And in the very first lockdown, when there was no traffic, nobody was going anywhere, everything went incredibly quiet. And suddenly this busy town, Llandudno, was full of these feral goats who came down and were wandering around the streets, munching people's gardens. And this poem, I thought, really captured that atmosphere, the goats of Llandudno. Goats are eating the municipal flowers in Llandudno. They trot from plate to plate of tulips, primulas, violets, set out like iced cakes. Here comes the light orchestra of hooves, occasional bray from a throat, small blasts from vocal accompaniment, bleat music. And people locked up by the virus, those who fashioned the gardens as stained glass windows, watch through panes as creatures devour a street feast, retreat to the great orme at midnight to sleep off the crimson, scarlet, purple, and gold. And that's for Isabel.
Yes, thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Isabel. A poetic version of a news story, and I do remember very vividly those news reports. The opening line says a lot, doesn't it? Goats are eating the municipal flowers. It's not the kind of line anybody would ever think that would be written in a poem that was actually totally factual. But Isabel has done a great job of just capturing that moment and committing it to poetry. Okay. Katie.
It's got a kind of Dionysian quality about it, hasn't it? That poem about the goats.
Yeah. Okay. Katie, thank you for joining us. Katie Deutsch, who was the winner of the Under-18s poetry competition with a poem called Silently Ignoring the World. Katie has emerged from behind the owl with the very dark eyes. It's great to see you. Katie, would you like to fire away and read us your poem, please?
Silently ignoring the world. It is late. Scrolling through my phone, silently ignoring the world. At this time, I can pretend nothing is wrong, everything is normal, everything is good. While the world is in shambles, I sit alone in my room. It is late, silently ignoring the world.
Yeah, and let me just ask you, Katie. I know it's an obvious question. Where did the poem come from? But I just wondered, considering the amount of time that you will have spent scrolling through your phone, was there one moment when you thought, I can make a poem out of this?
Not really. It was more like a collection of lots of little moments of just very much like looking at all of these like weird things that are happening in the world and just feeling so disconnected from them all. And just being able to just like turn it off and look at something else. And that just felt so weird to me. And then I saw the advertisement basically for the competition. I thought, oh, hey, that's something that I've been experiencing that I could talk about.
Yeah, and it worked out really well. As soon as you start reading your poem, everybody's ears prick up, of course, because we hear a voice which does not sound like the normal voice that we hear at normal Nicholson poetry events. Now, I think you're originally from California. You now live in Cambridgeshire. So how come you're living in England, Katie?
Everyone always asks me this, and honestly, I always feel really bad because it's really boring. It's just that like my parents wanted something new, and my dad was his company was going through something, and he wasn't sure he was going to be able to keep his job, so he started looking, and England was a place my parents always wanted to go. So he found a job, and we moved.
How old were you then?
I was 10.
Okay, so you've obviously got used to being in England now. How do you find it?
It's really nice. The weather's a lot less oppressive. The people are very nice. There's lots of cool castles to go to.
That's great. And just getting back to the poetry, have you had much reaction to the fact that your poetry is being published now?
Honestly, it still feels so weird. Like it's been a while, but it still doesn't feel quite real.
Yeah, I believe that you had a local bookshop which was quite keen on getting hold of some copies to sell. Is that right?
Yeah.
That must have been great.
Yeah, we like to go there, and they're the person who owns it, we know them, and they're very nice. So it was really nice to see them taking an interest.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for reading for us, and congratulations again on being our under 18 winner, Katie Deutsch.
I'd say that, I'd echo that. And I'd say to all the young poets that we've got 3 of them tonight, and I'd say, please stick with it, because I got my first poems published when I was very, very young, and I was absolutely knocked out by it, and kind of got addicted to seeing my name in print. I stuck with it, and it's not easy, because as you get older, there's so many other adults writing poetry, but it is so worth it. So don't give up. Keep writing poetry. Keep going. It's great.
Yeah, and I think the same message applies to our next poet, Mihak Vijay Chawla, who's joining us from Delhi, where the time is probably 2 minutes to midnight now, I think. So, Mihak, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, your poem is called Saviours Burning the Midnight Oil. This is slightly out of the order in the book, but I was very much aware that we'd be entering the wee small hours in Delhi, so I didn't want Mihak to have to wait until the very end. I'm going to ask her to read it in just a moment, but I was just rereading it myself earlier on, and it is a very detailed poem which almost picks up on, well, I'm sure it does pick up on real life individuals and their own particular stories and the way they've contributed to the fight against COVID in India. And Mihak has turned this into this very moving poem. So Mihak, would you please like to read for us Saviours Burning the Midnight Oil?
Life is tattered and covered with grim. Many face terrible difficulties all the time. Shortages of food supplies and struggle for basic amenities. Subhash Mandik, a posted man at Solid Waste Management, after supervising garbage vehicles day and night, became a patient of corona, refused by all hospitals, while his condition deteriorated and being depressed, citing unavailability of beds, and died after 2 days of being admitted. We should know he's our coronavirus warrior. Managing funerals of loved ones who died of corona became a struggling task. Jitendra Singh Shinti took it upon himself to perform the last rites of people, conducted 45 incinerations, and has been the savior for the whole nation. During COVID in Mumbai, Vijay Gait, a security guard, burned the midnight oil to make up the courage and to do his job. He wrote his experience on a trip to hospital, which pleaded citizens to stay at home. At the last moment of his life, fighting with his wife to go to his duty, but later he died. What about the backbone of Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation? Ratna Prabha Dabholkar, being a patient of diabetes and blood pressure, always moved on and never lost her spirit to serve the country. Dr. Trupati Kaddev is bombarded with stones by a mob in Indore. They will unceasingly move on to serve the nation and perform their duties in these times. Another female, Dr. Zakia Syed, who got injured, keeps on fighting and always has a hope to win in such a situation. Battling hunger and fatigue, a laborer father with his 7-year-old son, they trekked hundreds of kilometers in the heat barefooted, driven by the prospects of making ways to their wards. They were not alone. Some had young children and pregnant women, begging for food, screaming and roaring. Physically challenged women at the Chennai Corporation Center, Ningampakam, worked through the night to prepare masks from reusable fabric for the sanitary health workers, contributing for the nation. Asha workers were beaten to death for small protests. Going to conduct the door-to-door service, they knocked on a family's door, who refused to cooperate. A family so mad that they blew their top, beating the Asha workers with sticks. I feel proud of all these coronavirus warriors. They struggled for the country's betterment and always had an optimism to help. So why not help them by staying at home? Thank you.
Well, I think that that poem gives us a brilliant insight and a better insight than a dozen news reports into what COVID has been like, and I imagine still is like, unfortunately, in India. So many different individual cases you've picked out there, Mihak. And all the people that you named there, are they all real people that you've seen in news reports, or are they, from your own imagination?
No, they are actually the real people. Like during this pandemic, I was very much linked to the newspapers and TV channels. So like I just got to know about them and I just penned it down. So they are real people.
Right. And you mentioned towards the end of the poem, Asha workers were beaten to death, small protests. What's an Asha worker? Is Asha, is it a charitable organization in India?
Yeah, it's like a charitable that works for free. It is basically a group of women in the rural areas who work for the things that are not in who are basically in need to the rural people, but they are not getting it. So basically, they just ask the government, and they do protests for getting the mask and everything. Like sometimes they also make the mask. So that is what it is.
Thank you very much. Catherine, I think we were both absolutely delighted to receive quite a number of entries from overseas, and particularly Mihak's.
Absolutely. And Mihak's told such amazing stories of how it was in another country. And I think the one thing about this pandemic is that it did get a bit claustrophobic at one point, that we were all concentrating on our own problems in our own communities, in our own country, without really looking. The news, when I switched the news on, it was generally about local things and not a great deal about what was happening in other countries. And there were some really awful experiences going on in places like India, which is very rural, very poor, very rural communities. And Mihak's just brought all that alive, and I thought it was beautifully done. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Mihak. We'll move on to our sixth poet now, Marion Bowman. Marion lives in Cockermouth, although she spent I think most of her working career, if not all, in London. She's also the chair of Kirkgate Arts. And Marion, your poem is called For Joan and George. Marion.
Thank you. For Joan and George, 4th of June, 2020. The rain swept over Bass Lake, in a smoky pall the day they burned your body. It was the end of that parched, dry spring of 2020. Blurred visions of just how wrong we'd gone. No rain and ash trees dying back. The cindery hints of where we were to go. I watched the shower clouds swing round the peak of Lord's Seat and Bath from high on Noble Knot, with Skiddaw wreathed in grey and me in sorrow at your passing. Binsey to the west, the rain sad fells, indifferent to our follies, spattered by tearful drops, the downpour sweeping east through long empty glacial valleys. It had been the hot, unseasonal spring of 2020, blurred visions of just how wrong we'd gone, through visors, swathed in gloves and gowns, the pestilence and plague that brought you down. No sight of you those last weeks, isolated, the virus taking hold and silencing your voice. But still, I heard a distanced call from you. Make life matter. We moved into the fervid COVID summer of 2020, blurred visions of just how wrong we'd gone, when all the meanings of I can't breathe turned sharp and cleared the air and showed a path, the sunlit where you'd gone, the way of love and joy and passion. All life matters. All lives matter. Black lives matter.
Marion, I found that an incredibly personal poem, and yet you've managed to link it to a global issue. So you cover a heck of a lot of ground in that poem, don't you? And there's a lot of heartfelt commitment in there, isn't there?
Well, I was very upset on the day that my friend died, and was, well, on the day of her funeral in particular, because none of us could go to the funerals. So I, having seen her coffin pass through Cockermouth Main Street, I went up onto Whinlatter and took some time just to be in nature, really. And then the rain came in, and I was just reflecting on how you deal with loss, really, how you live with loss, what you have to do to make a life to live with loss. And it was about life and living and what people's values are. And I was very much inspired in moving from the sorrow and the grief into seeing a way forward for myself by considering her values, my friend Joan Ellis. And she was an internationalist, she was very political, she was a feminist, she was an environmentalist, she was a socialist, and she would have been out there on the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, one of the first to do that. She dedicated her life to making things better for everybody and for the planet. And it just came to me out of, I don't know where, the depths, and I had to write it down.
Yeah, I mean, that line, I heard a distant call from you, make life matter. That says so much, doesn't it? And that is the message. And if we're going to take any message out of what we've all been through for the last 18 months or so, surely that has to be it, make life matter.
Yeah.
Okay, Marion, thank you very much indeed for that, and thank you for joining us this evening to read it. Philip Burton. Philip, I'm glad you've joined us. I'm glad you made it. Philip, I can tell you guys was got a really good commendation in last year's Poetry Society stanza competition, and we're delighted that he also entered our competition. So Philip, would you like to read for us Hard-Boiled COVID Street, please?
Yeah, I dedicate this poem to Camilla Reeve, my publisher at Powell Press. Hard-Boiled COVID Street. Newly wed we plagued the council. They coughed up a house made of highly fragrant paint, a room with a rough enamel bath, boiler in the scullery, a separate room for anthracite, licorice flooring. We were into each other, a ménage à trois, she, the house, the adolescent me. Being innocent as two cherries, wild as weeds, young as the walls and street, we danced on the ceiling, went mad with stucco, rainbow quiche, footprints in concrete, garden mirrors, gnomes, wind chimes, and a mind-bending fence a child could have painted and did. COVID-19 zonked us, martyred our best bits, put the old oven lid on the left field we'd planted. The jazzy pagoda crackled and stained the communal bonfire. Carnival was clammed shut in its own Pentonville. Our dwelling surrendered to the street, became humdrum, vanilla, cross-referenced to a week of Sundays, lawn yawning at the mower, nothing curtains, elephantine TV, paint scheme white with a ghost of tangerine. Our house, one of a bag of hard-boiled sweets stuck together. Our bedroom, we've become wedded to it. We've sugared our fudge and lie in it, toffee-nosed. We're waiters lying, waiting for lockdown to end. We moan down the figures, connect each new spike with social kiss dancing neighbors who kick the new norm to the end of the road where no mower mows.
Thank you very much, Philip. Yeah, what a tale of frustration there, and it really does come across.
Rather second-hand, I'm afraid, based on my children.
Well,
Based on your children.
I'm sorry?
Based on your children.
Based on my children's experiences.
Yes. Well, that's why not?
Why not? Yes.
yes.
Wonderful.
Reap where one can.
Yes.
I like the line about putting the old oven lid on the left field we'd planted. Left field used in that context.
Yes.
Oh, that's brilliant. I love that line. That's terrific. Because there wasn't much left field activity going on, was there, for all those months when we couldn't really do.
I quite enjoyed playing around with left field, you know, the actual planting into the left field, left field being an American game term, and the actual planting into it, I felt pleased with, because I was messing around, I was playing with existing worn out phrases, and I love doing that.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So next up, it's Martin Halsall, who was the winner of the adult competition as judged by Kathleen. Kathleen, of course, seeing all the entries, but without having any idea who the poet actually was until after the decisions had been made. So Martin's got two poems in the book, so I'll ask him to start with the one that appears first. That is called Learning Wimbrel, and that was the winning poem. And this is Martin Halsall.
Thank you. Learning Wimbrel. He watched the birds by sound after his blindness, calling to mind from hearing small cassettes, species from song, each voice, as experts phrased it. He played tapes in the car as fingering notes. Historian, he never saw their geography. Light was just dawn or dark, denying detail. Lock on his eyes made prison, but also flight as birds came, bringing in their ancient music stories he'd once squint manuscripts to decode. Tapes brought him gifts of fluency and recognition. House martins, turr, turr, or beer, beer alarms as harvesters scythed air, adobe nesters. Locked down by plague, he'd conjure miles they travelled, tartan migration, by flung songs that he'd heard. Sea eagles, crick, rick, poise, G, in saw. His wife would check descriptions in her bird book. Clip, clip, in oyster catchers black and white. Lowlanders, pluit from an avocet. Evening in islands, listening from memory, her hand guided his elbow. His folding cane probed track for boulder. He caught the Lochans music, hearing ooid, 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 as Nordic phrasing of Wimbrel, mottled plumage like the burn that flowed among the words she read to him.
The thing about poetry is, isn't it, that words, phrases, sentences, verses, the whole poem, or just the title just stick with you. And with Martin's, it's the title. And ever since I've read this poem, I've been trying to learn the songs of the birds. I have learned a fair amount of blackbird. I will say that. But I am struggling to tell the difference between oystercatcher and redshank, both of whom we see quite a lot of near where we live. Kathleen, you decided that Martin's poem should be the winner. Was this one that jumped off the page at you, or was it one that wormed its way into your affection?
It kind of jumped off the page because it is so beautifully put together. It's beautifully structured. And although it's not directly about COVID or lockdown, it is about being deprived of senses. And that's what we all were during lockdown. We was all suffering from sensory deprivation. The other thing that struck me was in the first lockdown, particularly when there was hardly any traffic at all and no aeroplanes in the sky, the birds suddenly became very vocal, and everywhere you went, you could hear birdsong. And that seemed so strange and so beautiful. And so this poem really, really did strike a chord, and it is very cleverly written, very cleverly written.
So Martin, you have a second poem in the book, which appears on page 42. This is called The Inheritors. And for members of the Norman Nicholson Society, it is a poem whose subject is very close to home. So we'd love to hear it, please.
The Inheritors. Never a father, he sired the inheritors who follow him along green ways and the old ways. He leads them like Moses across the wilderness. Norman Nicholson, poet of pebble and mountain. He arrived early, sensing in the fiery furnace that lit the ironworks to an all-night sunset, a smelting of warning. His lines were shod with need to read a rescue for creation. His tone, adagio, curlew of estuary, shadow of Old Man Mountain glimpsed from attic. He transcribed singing stones of lime and granite, words his companions, to cast a summoning to all children through whom flowed veins of ink, to draft their protests as the weather changes, following his footsteps, where old nature of slag restores itself in journals of this plague year. He saw young like himself as refugees from war, as he grasped shadows in the sanatorium, as flying a boss kite into high blue future, as he sensed stirred world breathing within his garret. He taught them, green grandfather who saw beyond them, casting his lines as angling for their futures, calling them from his lock, beyond fells and walls, to march, design red banners, defy by stanza, to honour his grace days and recast his past, like his sculptured head, clean-eyed between hedging sideboards. That staring into liberation after lock and key, that miracle, turning a weather vane into a pencil.
Thank you very much, Martin. This afternoon, we heard from Jeff Cowton, curator of the museum in Grasmere, the Wordsworth Grasmere. And he alluded to Norman Nicholson being a poet who had followed on from Wordsworth and had to discuss his literary relationship with Wordsworth. And so I think it's really appropriate that now, in 2021, we're talking about a poem which looks at the relationship that we have with Norman Nicholson himself. I mean, the poem, Martin, you know, is full of clever allusions to Norman. There are phrases and words which echo his own work. For me, and I'll ask Kathleen for, you know, to comment on this in a moment. The lines that stood out were, his lines were shod with need to read a rescue for creation. And this is what gives Norman Nicholson such relevance today. Do you think, Martin, is this perhaps one of the key lines in your poem?
Yes, but it's also hopefully a poem of tribute to the younger people who've contributed to our competition, because we're looking back at Norman as a sort of founding father, if you like, of the sort of ecological poetry that so many young poets are writing today. And hopefully it's a poem of encouragement and stimulation to them as well.
Yeah, I like particularly, he taught them, green grandfather who saw beyond them. Casting lines as angling for their futures.
I think he did have this vision, really, this almost prophetic vision, while acknowledging the dangers that were beginning to encompass creation at the time he was writing, but also possibly this appeal to generations of writers that would follow to catch his vision, catch his priorities, and to write about them.
Yeah.
Can I just ask? I love the last line too, and I don't quite understand it, but
Well, I suppose it's an attempt in a way to look at the climate crisis and look at the whole situation of the weather.
Yes, it's
changing around us.
Wonderfully condensed line. I love it. Yes.
Then it sort of transposes that experience into the symbol of the weather vane, and then again takes it a little bit further into perhaps the pencil of with which he wrote, or with which we write, and so again it's hopefully pushing things forward a bit.
Yes.
I thought it was a direct reference to the pot geranium.
Right.
There is I think a weather vane, and he talks about being able to put his whole experience into writing.
Yes.
And I kind of, what about you, Charlie? Did you get anything from that?
Well, I must admit, I'm glad that Maggie asked the question, because I was a little puzzled by the last line. I really liked it, but I wasn't quite sure if I was understanding it enough. So I'm glad that Maggie asked the question.
Yes, it's lovely.
But, yeah.
Very condensed.
But of course, very much so. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much for that, Martin. And I think it's great that you were able to put the focus on Norman himself, and as you rightly say, use it as a means of encouraging the poets of the present day and the future. So we'll move on now to poet number 9 in our running order, and that's Martin Rees. Oh, just before we do move on, I should just mention that both those poems that we heard from Martin just then will appear in an upcoming collection by Martin, which is all on the theme of lament and the climate crisis. So do you have a title for that yet, Martin?
Well, it's a hoped for collection. It's just being completed at the moment, but the overall, the working title is Adagio.
Right. Okay, thank you. Keep us up to date with any news on that, please.
Yeah.
So Martin Rees, thank you very much for joining us from Bristol. Martin has got no fewer than 3 poems in the anthology. So Martin, could I ask you to unmute and read us, please, the first one that appears in order, and that is called The Window.
I have been looking at this view for 30 years, dry-eyed or in tears, but now the sky seems bluer than before, and the trees more green to one who hides indoors. Outside remains the same, but in the air the virus flows and must give pause to those who know the data and its flaws, the sophistry of government and arbitrary laws. Some call the dying by their names and risk their all in simple acts where kindness loses count, yet lifts the human from the mire to balance the accounts.
Thank you, Martin. You've been looking at this view for 30 years. How do you think the view looks now? Has it developed at all since you wrote the poem?
It looks a bit brighter. There's a big D in the sky still, but we're hoping that will go.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. And so let's move on to your second poem, which took third prize in our competition. This is on page 44 in the book, and it's called Wildwood. And I think I'm right in saying that this, along with your third poem, is focused on Lee Woods, which is a part of Bristol which I know from my university days, and I think Kathleen will probably know as well. Just across the suspension bridge from Clifton, and you're in the woods, which is a lovely place to go. And Martin, your poem is called Wildwood.
Thank you. This is as close as the city gets to wild. Below the thunder of arterials, a blackbird thrills, magpies clatter and complain, and a dog pauses to listen, free from walls and enclosed air, stale with traffic and fags. Limestone spurs and gorges, grey-brown water, stink of wild garlic, sheet white, frothing down the valley, and oaks, sentient oaks standing their ground through season and storm, their channeled bark, cicatrice worn as skin, roots raveling away into dark, touching underground colonies, worm paths, minerals and fungi, converting sunlight for the strong branches to cage the day moon's face, pushing slowly skywards. They stand, every ring a ripple out from the first shoot, and our time span barely girths an inch.
Thank you very much, Martin. Kathleen, when you picked out this particular poem, Wildwood, what was it in particular that you liked about it?
Yeah, I mean, all these poems were anonymous, and they all came through separately on separate sheets of paper. But I didn't know when I chose 3 poems by Martin that they were all by Martin. And I didn't know these 2 are obviously both Lee Woods, and like Martin, like Charlie, I went to Bristol University as well in the 1980s, and knew Lee Woods very well from where I was living. This was just the most beautiful description of where we all got great comfort during the whole of the pandemic and the various lockdowns, and walking in the natural world, and particularly walking in woodland. There's something about trees and woodland that was very comforting to walk in. And so that I felt that this poem in particular really captured that sense of comfort. And the way I loved the word, there are lines in this, I really did, roots raveling away into dark. It was brilliant. Yeah, I really liked it.
Okay, so Martin, could we now ask you to read your third poem, which is on the very next page in the book, and this is called Lee Woods in Lockdown.
Alone with blackbird and wren, under the leaves arch and beech's green fire, trunks sleek as unformed girls. Distance on the city, seldom cars rumble and hiss the portway. Civilization sliding sideways, denaturing, diverging. Dog walkers edge past with tight smiles, all a long way from home on a wide walk, eyes wary, finding air in these airless times. Thank you.
Yeah, another really striking poem. And I think, you know, if I may venture to say so, Martin, I think you've got a terrific gift for saying a lot in a very short space of time. It's really punchy. Civilization sliding sideways, just like the COVID crisis, something that you would never think could happen. And that somehow you've conjured up a great image there. The line that really struck me was actually the last one, finding air in these airless times, which is very reminiscent of a Norman Nicholson line when he wrote a poem called Windscale,
Yeah.
which followed a near catastrophic escape of radioactivity from the nuclear plant in the 1950s, which includes the line, "Children suffocate in God's fresh air." There's a very similar feel about that. How can this make sense, finding air in airless times? And yet we all know what you mean. So can you tell us a little bit about how that poem came about? Was that a spur of the moment thing, or did a lot go into it?
It was a particularly vivid walk in the woodlands. I will say that my wife had had a life-threatening sepsis on her leg, and so we really couldn't walk very far at this time. And she'd already been indoors for best part of 6 months. So when COVID came, it was like a year's sentence for us. And so getting out was really a huge relief. I can't put it in any other way. That spring happening outside the windows, if we hadn't have got out, we would have gone a bit crazy, I think. So that came out of one particular walk where the sunlight was incredibly vivid on these young birch trees. Just an amazing kind of release.
Thank you. Thank you very much for reading us your 3 poems this evening, Martin. That was great. So next up for us this evening, this special poetry evening at the Norman Nicholson Festival, is another of our under 18 poets. And this is Ruchitha Arasakoni, who lives in the Wirral, although was actually born in the Netherlands. Ruchitha, could you please unmute and please read us your poem, which is called Hidden?
I think Ruchitha's momentarily vanished. She was here a minute
She dipped
ago.
out. She
Yeah.
was. Okay, all right. Well, we'll watch
We'll
for her
be
coming
back.
back in.
Yeah, we'll watch for her coming back in.
Yeah, okay, thank you for spotting that, Kathy. Okay, so Anne Banks, please. It is time for you to clear your throat, Anne, because you've got 2 poems for us. Anne is another of our local Cumbrian poets from Kendal. Also had a commended poem in the anthology, and this is called One Walk a Day Haiku. Anne.
One walk a day. Out on Cundrick Scar, curlews flute, skylarks warble over silent roads. Bright darts of sapphire, kingfishers shimmer upstream, spell of reflection. Wood anemones raise white faces to the sun in golden limbo. Garlic wild in woods, wind-blown beech splinters and falls, sirens on fellside. Hawthorn leaves new green tremble in the frosted breeze. In town nothing stirs. Woodpecker yaffles, wagtail, warbler, wren take flight. Plains grounded, skies clear. Across grey stone walls, purple aubrietia bellies. Neighbours wave and chat. Blossom by the Kent, gaudy branches reach towards a padlocked playground. We keep our distance, shaken to see so many die. Bluebells bow their heads.
Thank you, Anne. I mean, that is a remarkable poem. It is remarkable for its format, as well as the punch it delivers and the ground that it covers and the description in there. What made you go for the haiku format? You know, did you feel as if it wasn't hard enough writing a poem anyway?
Well, I really struggled. I mean, I wrote this at the end of March. And I don't know about some, I think many people are the same as me. I was in shock for the first week of lockdown, really. And I couldn't reconcile going out for these beautiful walks in the lovely weather with the horrible stuff that was going on television and all around us. And I just thought, how can I reconcile that? And then I saw in a poetry book, a poem which was a linked haiku, lots and lots of haikus. And I thought, yes, because haiku, you can have a shift in subject in the third line. And so I started to pick out all these things I'd been seeing in my walks, and then also the bad things, and it seemed to work as a form. So I just wrote them all individually and then put them together, and that was it, really.
She says as if there was nothing to it, really. But yes, thank you. Kathleen, did that come as a bit of a surprise to you?
No, not really. I loved it. I love this idea of linked haiku. I think it's a beautiful form, and it worked really well. These very short lines with these specific images, and it had a cumulative effect. It was fantastic until the very last haiku, shaken to see so many die, and you suddenly realize what is the undertow of the whole poem. So I thought it was very clever.
Thank you.
So Anne, you have a second poem in the anthology. This is on page 50, and this is a poem which I think will resonate with an awful lot of us hearing you read it this evening. And this is called Reading to Charlotte.
Reading to Charlotte. She tends to slip down out of sight. I wonder if she has left, bored by fawn and beaver, lion and witch. But then I spot the top of her head. I hold up a picture, black and white. She bobs up again, headphones clamped on, eyes wide, laughing. I want to reach through the screen, grab her hand tight and pull us both through, run with her, race with the dryads and naiads, centaurs and leopards, follow the great river downstream to Cair Paravel by the shimmering sea. I touch the glass.
Yes, I think most of us will know exactly what you mean there, and I can see a few heads nodding in agreement. I touched the glass, ... Oh dear, what an awful time that was. I want to reach through the screen and grab her hand tight. I can almost see your eyes welling up when you write that, because mine are going a bit like that just reading it. I think you've put your finger on so much emotion that we've had to cope with, and it's not all been good emotion.
No, it summed up the poem, summed up the kind of separation that we were all feeling. And I until just a couple of weeks ago, I hadn't seen my grandchildren for over a year, and it's been very hard. And so that really rung a bell, that poem.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, very much so. And thank you indeed for reading us those two poems. So now we're through to Pauline Yarwood. Pauline's got two poems in the anthology. She's also been busy since then. She's got a second pamphlet called Loop, which was published in April, and that's obtainable from wayleavepress.co.uk, or you can get it from Pauline direct. Pauline is another Cumbrian poet from Crosthwaite, not too far from where I was born, although when I was born, it was called Westmoreland. And I still feel aggrieved at the administrators for wiping my native county off the map, but that is another story. Pauline, would you please read us the first of your poems, which is called Secession?
Yes, thank you, Charlie, thank you. Secession. Frauds, deceivers, you do not console. Poetry's done for. It's too hard now. Yesterday, I closed my eyes and saw I was standing barefoot in darkness, facing the cavernous black opening of a mountain tunnel. I strained to pick up the sound of a train which would surely destroy me in seconds. But no train came. What came was the thunderous cawing and screaming of dark shapes that sped towards me, round me, over me, screeching, back off, you stand alone. Hundreds of them flying from black space into black space, hungry, angry. They looked like ravens, crows, rooks, but I knew they were words.
Yeah, that really got me. That really got me, Pauline, when I read it. We had all this time to write in, this wonderful, wonderful time. I was furloughed and went from, you know, working frantically every hour there was during the week to doing absolutely nothing. And I thought, this is great, you know, I can write. I've got all the time in the world to write now. Words. Poetry's done for, it's too hard now. It certainly was. I could not write anything, and I'm still living with the trauma of it.
Yes, that's exactly how I felt. I was reading odd bits of poetry that was appearing all over the place, maybe on Twitter or Instagram or something like that. And it all seemed to be, you know, very, very accessible, but in many ways over emotional. It wasn't moving me. And then when I stopped writing myself, and when I tried to write, I just couldn't do it. I just felt that there was this withdrawal from language, really. Everything was so shocking. The scenes we were seeing, the stories we were hearing, it was just shocking. And I just came to a halt, really.
Yeah, it was beyond words.
Yeah.
And I thought it was very clever, because apart from the two exclamation marks at the beginning, there's no punctuation in it. You were using the rhythm of it and the lines, the way you scanned the lines, to replace punctuation, which I thought was great. It's very clever.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, so that leads us on, Pauline, to your second poem in the book, which is on page 46.
Yeah.
And this one is called Things Change. If you could read that.
Different. Very different. Things change. He'd have been over the moon, cock a hoop, would have put his hands on my shoulders, held me still and told me that I looked really good, so much better. We never met without him asking why I always had my hair so short. To deflect male interest? To punish him for not seeing I was more than the way I looked? Because the first love letter was addressed to the girl with short hair? Because someone once said he couldn't believe he was sleeping with someone with hair shorter than his, and I deemed that a triumph. Some of us have just Zoomed our oldest friend. She's 89, the pale golden hair of her youth still with her. And here on week 15 of lockdown, our first conversation is the one obsessing the nation. When will we dare get our hair cut? One of us is cutting her own with nail scissors. One of us not yet embracing grey, colours hers at home. One of us has cancelled the only appointment she could get. One of us impulsively shot into an empty barber's shop. We don't talk of the virus. We don't talk of Helen, Aphrodite, Isis, even of Samson. We know hair speaks. We know its power. So Dad, look, at last, scared of dying, I'm letting my hair grow.
Thank you very much for that, Pauline. I mean, that's obviously a very personal moment, a personal issue, personal recollections, and we know hair speaks. We know its power. What a conclusion to reach.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it just astonished me that you know that we were all very different people. There was men and women there. The men were saying a similar thing, and nobody could actually get the courage to go and book an appointment. Really, they didn't want to go. And I was when we all Zoomed, particularly for the oldest friend. You know, I was expecting a more political, you COVID-based discussion about what was happening, and no, there we were all sitting saying, oh, we don't get our hair cut, and it all seemed so trivial. And then I started to think about hair, and it reminded me of my dad always hating my short hair, and so it went on. So I wrote it as a bit of fun, really, and I'm not sure how I was brave enough to send it off to the Normal Nicholson, but anyway, I did. I'm very, very glad I did now.
Yes, I'm glad that you did, and I mean, again, I'm sure Kathleen will agree with me that one of the lovely things about this whole competition, the whole experience, was the sheer variety. We've all been through the same thing, but we've witnessed it in so many different ways, and we pick up so many totally different aspects to talk about, to write poetry about, and if something good comes out of something awful, I think the literary outpouring is at least something good that's come out of something absolutely horrendous.
Can I just ask if Rukshida's reappeared at all in the waiting room, or?
No, I am keeping an eye open, and she hasn't reappeared, so perhaps she had to dash off to something, unfortunately.
It is getting quite late. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. When we have two poets to go, I think perhaps at this point it would be good perhaps if I ask all the poets if they could perhaps give a round of applause to all those who've joined us simply to form the audience, because what is a performance without an audience? So all those who've joined to listen, thank you very, very much.
Yes.
Yeah, it's been absolutely lovely to have everybody here. Okay. Right. Okay. Oh, it's lovely to see you as well. Quite a few put your cameras on. Hooray! How nice to see the people behind the bare descriptions. So yeah, thank you for doing that. That's lovely. So now, Deborah Maccabee. Deborah lives in Leeds now, formerly from London. Her poem also commended by Kathleen in the competition. And Deborah's poem is called Violet Carpenter B. So Deborah, the floor is yours.
Violet Carpenter B. A big black bee against my window pane crackles with rage, struggling in vain in wild, frustrated agony to pass the inexplicable barrier of glass. The window's stuck, but I open wide the big glass patio door and guide my winter tenant to the spring outside. She circles once, then seems to hesitate, then sallies forth to feed and pollinate. And I feel honored to have set her free, essential worker for humanity. When hierarchy breaks down in the hive, only the wild bee keeps the world alive. Carpenter bee brought to these northern climes by a warming planet in perilous times. Violet carpenter bee, whose wings change hue in sunlight to a dark translucent blue. Wild flowers unfold for her their nectar treasure. All nature wakes to labor that is pleasure. Birds build their nests in budding trees and sing, with gold dust glistening on leg and wing. From flower to flower my bee goes visiting, oblivious to social distancing. But while I set my bee at large to roam, mankind immobilized remains at home. A microbe holds humanity in thrall behind a baffling and invisible wall. Lockdown will end one day when they will find a vaccine or a cure. But can mankind defeat the pathogen within the mind? And breaking man-made walls and distancing, experience at last the human spring. Thanks.
Ooh, there is an awful lot going on in that poem, isn't there? There is so much going on, and how lovely to hear you reading it yourself, Deborah. I mean, I know this is a soft question, But you must be so pleased with that poem. I mean, I know poets quite often are really fed up with their poems when they finish writing it, but that just works so well.
Well, I spent a lot of time writing it. I had so many different versions. But in fact, the idea of writing it just came quite suddenly it was just after lockdown had been imposed. And I was just in this state of bewilderment that we were all in. And I came down in the morning and I saw this huge bee. And it was making the most incredible noise, a very, very incredibly loud noise. I'd never seen such a big bee and heard such a terrible noise. I thought it was the window cleaner at first. And then I realized it sounded like some machine cleaning the windows. And it was this extraordinary bee I'd never seen the likes of before. And at first I was terrified of it. I was really scared of it. And then just suddenly, it just happened in a second, I suddenly felt this tremendous sense of empathy with it. I felt I knew how it felt, that it was trying to get out of this glass, and it couldn't understand the glass. It was utterly bewildered and it was so angry and frustrated, and it couldn't understand why. It saw this transparent glass. It had just woken up from hibernation, and it saw the spring outside and it was impelled to fly towards it. And this glass kept getting in the way all the time and it couldn't understand it. And when I felt this sense of empathy, it was a real gut emotional feeling. I stopped feeling afraid of it. It shows how empathy drives out fear. And I just wanted to help it to get out. And then I got it out and I felt a real sense of joy amid lockdown, watching it fly free. And then I thought, this bee is flying free and we're all stuck in lockdown. And it just aroused so many feelings. It was basically originally a feeling, but then there were so many thoughts attached to it. And also I looked it up online and I'm convinced it was the violet carpenter bee, which has only just started coming to the UK, because it's been coming for the past 6 or 7 years. And I looked it up and found out a lot about it while I worked on the poem, and I kind of wove all that in. And I spent a lot of time working on it. Originally, I had a verse about climate change, but it just looked as though I'd brought it in to bring in climate change. So then I kind of wove it into the poem, which made it work much better.
Yeah, I think you have woven a lot into the poem, really. I suppose the burning question is, can mankind defeat the pathogen within the mind?
Yes. Well, and first of all, I finished on that line, behind a baffling and invisible wall, and that was the end. But then it just seemed so depressing to finish like that. So then I started trying to look beyond it, the feeling that maybe something good can come out of all this.
Yeah. Kathleen, it's fascinating to just hear Deborah's account of how it all happened.
Yep. It's a beautifully crafted poem, and as you've already said, it says so much about us and we're not just facing the pandemic, we're facing climate change as well, and and now of course we are dealing with one of the pathogens within the mind of getting out of lockdown, and the loss of confidence and the feeling of vulnerability that we all have.
Deborah, thank you very much indeed for writing your poem and reading it for us tonight. Just a couple of messages on the chat. Kelly Davis, who was with us as a member of the audience before. Kelly is herself a very well-known poet in Cumbria. Many thanks for a wonderful evening of poetry. I'm afraid I have to go now. Apologies and thanks again all. And also from another member of our audience, Linda Haggerston. So many wonderful poems tonight, created around a dreadful situation. Thank you, everyone. Congratulations to all the poets, sending you all love and gratitude. I'm sorry that I also have to leave now. Well, nice to see those messages. As we move on to the last of our poets this evening, and that's Susan Cartwright Smith, who has 3 poems. Hello, Susan, thank you for waiting.
Hi there.
Hi, right, good to see you
I
there.
hope you can hear me okay, because I'm in the wilds overseeing a scout weekend, so I hope my voice is clear enough.
Okay, we've got you at the moment. So your first poem is called Small Things, and it's over to you.
Thank you. Small things. Small things like a walk, a leaf, a bird, or a freckle shyly showing on a sun-kissed shoulder, or an ammonite curling millipede discovered under lifted stone, a snatch of tufted grass for a nest in beak, a grain of soil under fingernail from long gone green emerging fingers, the fleeting smell of morning dampened grass and wood smoke, coffee fresh on stove, toast, and acrid tang of marmite, and the precious hour of time alone are punctuations to the endless days where edges blur.
Thank you. Small things. I think that's a theme that we've heard more than once tonight. We heard it in Deborah's poem before about the simple act of opening a window so a bee could fly out suddenly means a lot and symbolizes even more. Punctuations to the endless days where edges blur. We've heard the word blur a couple of times as well, haven't we? I think maybe what we've all been trying to do is to sharpen the blur, get rid of the blur and find some kind of meaning in amongst everything that's been going on. Is that a fair comment, Susan?
I think so. I think it was a great shock to all of us, having to slow down, having to put diaries aside. I didn't open my diary for so long. It felt like a strange thing now. Having lived sort of almost hour to hour, looking at my diary to check what I was meant to be doing next, to having to do nothing because we had to self-isolate for the first fortnight before lockdown actually happened. Having that sudden nothingness, that slowness, that difference and completely different way of life that we knew, it was very alien to us all. And I think just, you know, a punctuation mark is a very small thing, but things to find to break our days up was very important, I think, to us all.
Yeah. And of course, going for the daily allowed walk was one of those punctuation marks. And you picked that up in your second poem in the book, which is on page 56. And this is called Emerging, if you'd kindly read that for us.
Thank you. Emerging. I am 2 meters from the only other person who is with me on our walk, which feels rebellious or somehow dangerous, as if we are now unsure if what we do, a simple act of walking, is allowed. But while we agonized and stood apart and stayed alone and masked and watched the clear blue skies and heard the bird song, life went on. And greenery has claimed the barren earth, and flying insects flit amongst the dancing stems. And in the water, alien creatures metamorphose undisturbed by net or plastic tub. And everywhere is full of life and verdant in this lost words world, which I have found once more. And me and my walking partner, 2 meters behind me, find that life, which finds a way, continues undisturbed, welcoming back those who gently tread, emerging slowly, like a nymph, becoming other in a new world. Behind our masks, feeling somehow lost, but finding ourselves once more, we find the words to say, this world is beautiful.
I know that I think you still are writer in residence for the Cumbria Wildlife Trust. Is that the case?
For the Gosling site, yes, which is a new reserve. And yes, the emerging site is sort of indicative of how we emerged back out of complete isolation to discovering what it is like to be sort of in where you live once more, because we couldn't go anywhere else. We had to discover the places that were near to us and became dear to us, I hope.
Yes, absolutely. It's just evident that you obviously got this passion for the outdoors, and that comes through in the poem. Kathleen,
I think somebody else mentioned about the bird song, that we suddenly heard bird song, and we hear it all the time, but it was so loud and it was amazing just to hear it, because normally noise sort of blankets it, but suddenly it was there every day, every time you went outside, you could hear it, and it was amazing. It was just a great rediscovery, I think.
Yeah. Kathy, one of the tasks that you had was to work out a running order for the book. And how did you come to make the decision to put these two poems of Susan's as the last two in the book?
I suppose because they are the hopeful poems. They're the ones where we're emerging from the pandemic. We're actually being let out. And also the last poem, Renewal, is a hopeful poem looking to the future. It's a very difficult thing putting an anthology together, because you have to kind of create a narrative through the anthology. And also, when you've got poems, one on either side of the pages when you open it, those two poems have to have some kind of dialogue with each other and some kind of relationship to each other. So it becomes, and you can't have too many poems on the same theme either. There's got to be a variation of tone and rhythm and like a piece of music. So it wasn't an easy job putting it together. But the last two poems that Susan is reading just naturally fell at the end of the book. It was great.
Okay, well, that takes us very nicely on to the last poem in the book and the last poem in this evening's performance, and it is called Renewal, and the poet again is Susan Cartwright-Smith.
Thank you. Renewal. Scraping back dead comfrey revealed a crumbling legacy and ampersanding worms whose naked flesh surprised us all. And clipping back the rosemary, let cowslips dance, and Easter roses gaze to heaven. I hack into woody stems of lavender, sprawled like weathered legs across emerging peony puckered lips, and pick the stems of life, and with an eye to next year, plunge them into waiting earth. Hope, a green-fingered goddess, looking onward.
Lovely.
And thank heavens for hope.
Signs, yeah.
Thank heavens for the ability to look onward. Thank heavens for the woody stems of lavender. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, yes, that's great. Thank you very much, Susan. And I mean, I just wonder what you made of Kathleen's comment there, actually, about your two poems being at the very end of the book, and the reasons why she chose to do that.
I think that's really lovely. I mean, I did sort of, it felt quite an honour to be the last poem in the book. I felt quite honoured about that. And I thought it must be because it was about emerging or looking forward, and the hope of getting out of it, rather than, reflection is obviously very important and very nurturing for our mental health. But I think the message of we can get past this is really important. So I thought that was possibly why it was there, and I'm really pleased to hear her say that's exactly why it was there. It's a real honour.
Okay. Right. Well, there we are. We are at the end of our evening. Marion Bowman has just posted a note on the chat saying, thanks to Charlie and Kathleen for a brilliant job in creating all these opportunities to write, read and hear this poetry, and the excellent production and presentation tonight. Well, thank you, Marion, very much for that. But of course, it's all down to you poets. Thank you so much for picking up on the challenge that we presented you last summer to try and put this experience into poetry. Thank you for persevering when I'm sure that there were battles along the way. And thank you for joining us this evening and making such a great event at the Norman Nicholson Festival. Kathleen, would you just like to say a few words to round off?
Yeah, I mean, I hope you're going to do this again, Charlie. Come on, we've got all these great poets out there.
Yeah. Well, I think there is definitely a feeling of togetherness. It's lovely that people have joined us. The vast majority of the poets who we saw tonight, we also heard when we did our first online event, which I think was back in October, beginning of November, when we launched the anthology. The issue isn't going to go away. The poetry isn't going to go away. We aren't going to go away. So who knows what the future may bring.
I think next time we should do something that's centered on Norman Nicholson's environmentalism and his passionate environmentalism. Something forward-looking, and so
Yes.
I think that would strike a chord. And as Jeff Cowton from the Wordsworth Trust was saying this afternoon, the all-important thing really to keep a poet's name and his writing alive is to look at what makes it relevant today. And so much of what Norman wrote is so relevant today.
Totally relevant. It's amazing. But I'd just like to say how great it was, what a privilege it was really to be able to be asked to judge this competition and to be able to read so many really, really good poems. And it was lovely and quite an emotional thing as well to read through all your work about all the different aspects of people's experience in the pandemic. It was very emotional.
Indeed. Okay. So thank you to Anne Banks and Kerry Derbyshire, and also to Martin Rita, who just posted some very nice messages on the chat. Thank you very much for those. The festival continues tomorrow. I know some of you will be joining us at 2 o'clock, when we're going to be hearing from 2 PhD students who are studying Norman Nicholson. That's Laura Day and Jack Threlfall Hartley, which will be great. And also, I will be formally launching the Norman Nicholson Audio Archive, which is something we've been working on for a little while. And this includes interviews that I've done with people who knew Nicholson personally. Who was the man behind the reputation? What was he really like? Along with that, we've also gained access to Radio Cumbria's archive of Nicholson readings and reports and interviews with Norman Nicholson. And so some of those will also be stored in our audio archive. Now, these will all be available on the Nicholson Society's website as from tomorrow, which is normannicholson.org. And the idea is that this should be a resource that's open to all. You don't need any special login or anything like that. Each individual piece of audio is all listed. It is described, so you've got some idea of what you can listen to. The duration is there. Information about the person who we're talking to and when the interviews were recorded are all there. So hopefully that will be something that people will enjoy referring to and listening to, and maybe hopefully learning something from for quite a long time to come. So all that's tomorrow from 2 p.m. But for tonight, a big thank you once again to all our poets, to all the members of our audience. Thank you very much indeed for a lovely evening, and good night.
Thank you.